Welcome to the Savvy Dentist podcast with Dr. Jesse Green, the show where great dentistry meets great business. Listen in each week as we bring you an inspiring person who will share their story, ideas and business techniques to help you create a practice and a life you love. And now introducing your host, Dr. Jesse Green.
Hello everyone, Jesse Green here. Welcome back to SavvyDentist.com and to the Savvy Dentist podcast. It's great to have your company for another episode of the show. Now, if you're a practice owner or an aspiring practice owner and you're thinking about where do I set up, what do I need to do in that regard, maybe it's a first location, maybe it's a subsequent location, then this podcast is going to be right up your alley because I'm joined by Julian Muldoon, who is the founder of One Group Property Advisory Services. Now, Julian's been helping health practitioners for years sort out their property situations. And in this conversation, we talk about three big elements of strategy. The first one is your location strategy. In other words, which area should I set up in? Where is there growth? Where are the opportunities? But once you've found the right location, what sort of property should I be looking for that allows for future growth? Do I rent it? Do I buy it? What's that look like? What are the considerations for each of those strategies? And finally, how does that interact with the business strategy? What are we trying to achieve from a commercial outcome point of view? And so what I really appreciate about Julian is his very skillful and practical nature of bringing all these things together into a cohesive picture. And you're going to want to have your pen and paper handy because there's some real value bombs that he drops, some real pearls of wisdom. And I know that whether you're setting up for the first time or setting up other practices or even relocating your existing practice, this is an episode you're going to want to really tune into and come back over and over and over again. Now, on a slightly different note, if you are a motivated and driven practice owner and you want to think about how to take your business to the next level, then come and join us in the Savvy Dentist Facebook group because in that group we have tools, we have training, we have cheat sheets and a whole bunch of things to help you accelerate the growth of your practice. So all you need to do is come across to Facebook, search for Savvy Dentist in the search bar, find the group, answer a few questions upon entry, and we'd love to welcome you in there. And we have some big plans for that group and we're going to be taking that to another level of resource for you as well. We can't wait to share those things with you. But for now, let's get on to our conversation with Julian. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I enjoyed recording it. Julian, welcome to the Savvy Dentist podcast. It's wonderful to have you here, mate. Thanks for making the time.
I'm excited to be here, Jesse. Thank you for having me.
It's going to be a lot of fun. Now, mate, you are the founder of One Group, which is a property advisory service, and I know lots of people that have utilised your services in the past. And I'm curious to talk about what you do and how you do it and some of the common pitfalls. But before we get into all of that, I'm always curious about how people find their way into their particular line of work because in my world, it's never usually a linear journey. And I'm just curious to ask, how did you find your way into property advice, helping people find the right location and so on and so forth? What's your story?
I think it definitely applies to my story, that it wasn't a planned move. I mean, it was around 12 years ago now. And I actually used a buyer's agent myself. So I made a couple of transactions. I was studying financial planning. I was working in HR at the time, recruiting in the banking space. So I was at a bit of a junction career-wise. And the buyer's agent I worked with who knew I loved property and was going down the financial planning path said, why don't you come and work with me and help me build the business? So it was just residential and commercial property. There wasn't a big health focus. And then over time, probably a 2 to 3 year period, I ended up buying into the business, buying the business out, and then merging with Tel, my now business partner. And we decided about 7 years ago, and this stage our health book or health client book was about 40% of our 40 to 50%. We said, look, that's the space that we enjoy the most. They're the clients that we feel we have the highest value with. We love the complexities of the business model, and I mean dental especially. We love the growth in the sector and the fact that we worked with the clients across investing, setting up business, and they were just so property centric and ambitious, and we could, partner with them on the journey. So that's how I started and how we got into the space.
As you said, you work with a lot of health professionals. It's a huge part of your business. And my observation is that sometimes people leave things to the last minute. They sometimes come and seek our services really early. Others leave it a little bit late. And I'm just wondering, what's your experience with that? When is the right time to start thinking about property strategy? Is it, obviously the sooner the better, but for those people listening to the program, when does property strategy need to feature in their thinking?
Yeah, I think it actually connects really well with your first question because I don't think people realize how complex property is and how many layers it has to it and how much research can be done and how much insight you can bring to your decisions. which is probably the reason why I got excited about the space in the first place. Because on the tenant side of the buy side, there isn't a lot of representation. There's a few back of the envelope type solutions that'll just kind of point and shoot at properties, but that really detailed analysis piece and having your business advisors connect with your property strategy and location strategy team, the collaboration is really where the power is. So I'd say that most people come to us really late in the process when they've hit a real pain point on junction. They can't pull a deal together, or the site's fallen over after 40, 50 hours and 6 months worth of time commitment, and they're really kind of stressed out and strung out by the fact that they've lost time and money on a potential deal. They're losing interest or maybe losing enthusiasm for it. But the best time is really early days in your planning piece. We love sitting down with the dentist that might be a year away because we can talk about buying versus leasing. There's no pressure on a site. They're starting to pull together their vision, their strategy. They've got their maybe one-page business plan they're working on, and we can give some great insights into the things that we do to help get them thinking down the right path. Then they come back 6 months later and say, hey, we're 90% complete on our business plan. We think we know where we want to be. We think we want to buy only, and we can say, great, these are your considerations, your zoning parameters, your budgets for the project. And then they really come back confident and ready to take action. That's probably the optimal process, which happens maybe 30% of the time.
I use the word property strategy, and you differentiate between location strategy and property strategy, which I think is a really key distinction. Wanted just to touch on location strategy for a second before we get into property strategy. Getting the location right is obviously critical. Getting it wrong can have ramifications that go on for years and indefinitely. What are the elements that you typically think about when you're considering a location or evaluating one location against another?
It's a great question, and probably the most important one that we always throw back to clients that come to us and say, we definitely want to be in suburb ABC. We say, well, what's the data points that you're considering? Because we feel our role isn't just to say, great, let's go find a property. It's really to say, is there a robust plan that's backed up with the right framework? And the first and most obvious one is definitely population density and competition analysis. So looking at the ratio piece of how many dentists per population and trying to keep that as high as possible, but at a minimum, 1 to 1,000 tends to be the number that we try and hone in on, or 1 to 1,500 is absolutely optimal. And not just for the specific postcode, but for the surrounding postcodes. So you've got to pull a few different data sets together to work out exactly what postcodes feed into each other, because it isn't that I drive to the boundary of my postcode and I can't go any further to access services. I've got to understand where the retail strips are, where the gravitation points are, like shopping centres and arterials, because there's always a flow of traffic and consumption within certain regions. So we've got to be aware of that too. So I'd love to say it's a really sequential process, but every area is totally different with how we use that data and information. We then want to look at things like private health uptake. We look at household formations. We look at their propensity for spending on health. We look at the amount of construction and development happening in the region and where it's going in, because construction leads population growth. Yep. And then we look specifically at how long those dentists have been set up, how many dentists are inside those businesses, and what kind of services they're offering. So we've got to get down to that granular, and then how busy they are. So I'd say there's some real macro data points, and then there's some real micro analysis. And the micro analysis is a partnership thing. Our clients know more about dental than we do. They're in the game. So that's where we work together. I'd say, we come back with 80% of the work done, and then we work with them to say, hey, do you think you can compete and have an impact in this region based on who you're up against? Yeah,
I really love that, because it's strategy, right? You're not kind of just throwing a dart at a dartboard and saying, I live in suburb A and therefore my practice has to be within a 5-minute driving zone of suburb A, because that may or may not be appropriate. But it's really interesting. I've seen that so many times over the years. I live in this particular suburb. I only want to work in this particular suburb or group of suburbs near home. And have you seen people do that before?
All the time. There's just so much convenience that flows into the decision.
Yeah.
And we get it. Most people that work across healthcare and dental is that they want their family people, right? They want to be around their partner, their kids. They want to be close to their community, and we totally understand that. But it does mean that you can at times be compromising on the business opportunity as a result of that. And the most successful practices that we see launching are the ones that really go in focused on the opportunity, and they're willing to drive another 20 minutes to get there, because they know that they're probably going to work less on the other side of it because of how good the opportunity is anyway.
Yeah, 100%. I've seen that too. So let's assume for the moment we've got our location strategy, we've identified a location or a couple of locations, and then we're talking about the property strategy now. And obviously we can talk about leasing versus buying. But again, if we were to think about site selection for a moment, just, around that property strategy, what are you guys thinking about? What are you looking at? Again, what are you considering as you're evaluating sites that may or may not be suitable versus other sites as well? What are those particular parameters that you're thinking about?
Once we know the specific region or area, and it's rarely a postcode, it's more of a group of postcodes and a group of suburbs that we're looking at. We can then look at where the optimal strips are and what the zoning is in those areas. So we're trying to leverage off foot traffic of a high street or of a shopping centre. We can map out the precinct and go, okay, well, that's a commercial 2 zone around that area, and that's a retail strip, no parking required on the retail strip, so we can take a smaller site. And we can start to work out exactly where the pockets of opportunity are based on where there's no competition, but also where there's a zoning that's suitable for the business use. We can start to build a bit of a parking framework in our mind as to whether we're going to be needing 4 car parks for 3 dentists, or we're going to be needing 12 car parks. And we can start to then say, well, price point, property scarcity, is it a buy strategy or a leasing strategy? Because rarely we'd say to the client, what do you want to do? We generally say in that area, if you're buying, it's probably going to be a 12-month exercise and you're going to need $3 million. Yeah. If you're leasing, there's going to be a property every 2 months. And we're going to be able to get you right in the thick of the action, because the most tightly held pocket is where there's the best opportunity. The question of buying versus leasing, we always ask, because it's up to the client what they want to do. Sure. But also I think it's really dependent on the area and where they want to set up, and then what the planning scheme is going to allow them to do within that area.
So, Julian, you've spoken about the lease versus buy question, and I totally get that there's financial considerations, property availability considerations, and so on and so forth. But you've also spoken about some of the town planning considerations. What are those town planning considerations? Does it go beyond car parking, or are there other factors that need to be considered in the town planning elements as well?
Yeah, look, most of the time car parking is the biggest challenge. For example, in Victoria, you get dental's a right of use, medical's a right of use in all residential zones, as an example. So it's very, very flexible in that sense, but you've got to comply with parking, you've got to comply with access to the site, and you've got to comply with signage, and you've also got to abut what's called a road zone or a transport zone, which is essentially a busy road. So it can get misconstrued because people think, well, and New South Wales is similar. I can just put a practice in any house I want. What's still got to be abutting what's considered to be a main arterial, and you've still got to have no access concerns. And that could be that you're talking to a town planner, then you've got to go to an architect to get conceptual plans done to see if the cars fit on the site and if they can move safely. And then you've got to get a traffic management consultant in to review that. So you've got 3 sub-consultants working together, along with potentially a designer who's doing the interior aspect to the property as well. So the summarising point there is you might have 4 or 5 different key parties that are all working together, and they need to be working together, because the last thing you want is you buy the site and there was a mistake and everyone's pointing their finger at each other. You really need everyone to be working in harmony on this. And then you've got to be able to price it, make sure it's suitable for the business, and then you might have to do that within a 21-day campaign because the property is actually going to auction. So the town planning piece is one step in the process, but generally they also need some advice from other consultants, like potentially traffic management or an architect, or someone else that feeds into the process with them. Commercial zone's always the quickest and easiest, and I'd say most dental clinics are generally more suited to more of a retail strip commercial zone property. But even if that's a shopping centre, you still need to make sure that there's an approval in the scope, because we've seen a lot of sites marketed as a health hub, and then when we actually get into the details of the planning permit, there was no approval for any healthcare. They've just realised healthcare would be great. Let's get some doctors and dentists in here. And then in the fine print, they'll say, you're responsible for your own approvals. And we say, well, hang on a sec. What if they say we need 7 dedicated car parks at the shopping centre, and you're not willing to give us 7 dedicated parks because you're saying there's 1,000 parks for everyone, share them. So there is definitely some granular points to that process. They sound a bit tedious, but I guess the key summarising point is just never commit to anything until you've got an independent town planner that you trust, that understands health, to have a look at the site.
Have you seen anyone get this hideously wrong before? I'm sure there's horror stories, and I feel really bad and sad for those people that might have suffered that, but what sort of things have you seen gone awry in that space?
The main one would be buying sites where the car parking isn't sufficient. I think buying more than leasing tends to be a problem. Leasing can be a really painful process. For example, if you sign up to an agreement and then later on you realise that there's deficiencies in the site, generally the landlord will kind of work with you to solve them. You'll probably chew into your rent-free period, your fit-out period. It'll be a really stressful process, and your worst case is you might be delayed for 6 to 12 months. So not fun and not optimal. But the worst case is probably not a significant financial burden. More just a really challenging, stressful experience. Whereas on the buying side, it's really, really tough and challenging in the sense that, you can have auctions in unconditional environments, and you've got to have, 100% of your due diligence done before that particular auction day. And you may not know whether you're going to get an approval until you submit, because all of this due diligence that we're doing up front is really only giving us, what's the chances? What's the likelihood of getting an approval? The best way to look at it is a change of use, if that's what's required, is no dissimilar to going through a development approval process with council. Even though you can put 3 townhouses on that block based on a precedence, you've still got to get council to sign off on it before you can actually operate out of that particular zone. Yep. So there is that small leap of faith there, which is why it's not everyone's cup of tea. I mean, ideally, we all want to own our own asset, and if you buy a vacant possession property and you put your dental business in there, you're probably increasing the value 30 to 40%, and you're your own landlord, security of tenure, all that stuff that we know. But there is a risk component there to get that reward.
Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned leasing, and lots of practices lease, and that's perfectly fine. It's a really good strategy for those that work it and do well with it. What typically happens in leases where people come unstuck? Again, you hear of the horrible landlord sort of scenario, but what are the things that you see? What are the main things you should have in a lease? And where do you think people might make some boo-boos or mistakes in that, mate?
Well, I think they're all structured differently. So the heads of the agreement, which is the first document you presented, they're all very different format. Some come in lots of information. There might be a 4 or 5 page document, and they're really granular on information, almost like a mini lease. And it's really around just going there and finding the problems with it. Others are a 1-page document, and we know there's not enough information in there. There's a lot of parameters that are actually missing. There's no demolition or relocation clause even highlighted as yes or no. We know it's going to come later in the lease. So the heads of agreement, probably the biggest challenge is, we would probably do 7 to 10 of these a month across the business. And I'd say none of them are the same. And we kind of learn something in nearly every single negotiation that we step into. So first of all, you got the documentation piece and the information, and then the blind spots that you might have for not being in that space full time. Then the agent's very different in every situation. The landlord's very different in every situation. Who they are from a wealth point of view, what their intention is with the site, what their financial levers are going to be are very different. Also, the condition of the tenancy at handover. Is the previous tenant's fit out still in there? Are they going to make good on that? How are they going to hand it over to you? Should that be landlord works or tenant works? So you're really integrating. Essentially, it's project management. And I think that's where, unfortunately, a lot of dentists focus on, what's the incentive? Am I getting 20%, 30% or 40%? And is my rent market or is it under market? But there's actually a lot more to it than that, and how you structure the terms to give you security of tenure as well. We're seeing a real push at the moment because funding is tougher. For example, greenfield development, shopping centres. A lot of dentists want to get into these shopping centres because all the big anchor tenants like Coles and Woolies are coming in, and there's no dentist within a few kilometres because it's a brand new shopping centre. But sometimes none of those tenants are starting for maybe 6 or 8 months after you move in. Or you're on a first floor and they're still doing all the construction on the ground floor, and no one can get to your tenancy. So there's so many nuances in those agreements. I'd say depending on the property, there's different challenges in every deal. But you really want to have the most detailed, robust, clear heads of agreement possible, because that just takes out a lot of stress at the lease stage. Because their opinion is once you get to the lease, they've kind of got you on the hook. They know you want to be in there. You paid for some plans. You've engaged an architect. Your lawyer's involved. The costs are getting higher and higher. They think you're more on the hook and you'll accept a lesser deal.
Yeah, it's on cost bias a bit. Wanted to ask about any particular clauses in leases that you would probably put a few red flags to. And I'm thinking things like ratchet clauses or anything of that nature. Are there any kind of things that you look at in a lease and go, I don't like that?
Yeah. I think the main one would be, I'd say for dental, is exclusivity. I think you've always got to have exclusivity, and they will be cheeky and put things like on level 3. You have exclusivity within the developments. Like, no, we need exclusivity for the whole precinct or the whole shopping centre. Yeah. Naturally, demolition relocation clauses, which is really common if the building's got the scope for the further development in the future, or a shopping centre where they say, look, we might decide we want to get a better pool of tenants operating out of a certain wing so they can leverage off each other. But just really educating the landlord on the cost to set up, the process to set up, the importance of not having to remove your cabinetry and try and reuse it again. It sounds really basic, but a lot of leasing agents have no idea about that stuff. And I think at the moment too, Jesse, increases, they're pushing them to 4 to 5% on the rental increase piece, which is really, 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 really expensive because most dentists are taking a 7 or a 10-year term to get a better incentive to help them launch more safely and viably. And the problem is they're going to have exorbitant rents in 10 years as a result of that.
So would that be counteracted by a market review at that particular juncture, or what would that be?
Well, market reviews are so subjective, especially in shopping centres, because what they'll do is they'll say, well, here are 3 tenants in the shopping centre that are paying 30% more than you. Maybe you should pay the same as them. So it's and then you can dispute it, and there can be an independent valuer to come in. But it's just you're kind of banking on everyone else doing a good deal too, right? And most of these other tenants around you are not doing good deals. So just because there's other bad deals around you doesn't necessarily mean you should be paying that rent. So it is quite challenging. And trying to cap the market reviews, we always put in there, maximum 5% on a market review so that you're not really blowing up your rent.
So one of the things we spoke about was incentives. You touched on that a moment ago. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about how to work with the landlords to maximise the value of those incentives, because we were talking a little bit off air about where sometimes things get derailed in that department. And I was just wondering if you could shed some light on how to maximise that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the most expensive thing you can ask for is cash. So if we say to the landlord, we would like $200,000 cash to help us get started, that's a greater cost than a rent-free period because they've actually got to have the cash on hand. They can't get that from the bank. It's got to be capital that they pull out of their savings account. Yep. So I think it really depends on who the landlord is. So the first question we always ask to the leasing agent is who's the landlord and what's important to them in this transaction. Because they might say, look, it's a private landlord. They're really proud of the building. It's family assets, a legacy. They want to hand it on to their kids. They will give you this information, especially when you say, look, I want a first right to purchase in the deal as well. And they might say, look, he'll never sell or she'll never sell because, it's for the kids. And you go, okay, great. The lever we have now is they're willing to invest in their building because it's a lifelong asset for them. So we know doing things like replacing the roof or anything structural or new aircon systems and amenities upgrades, they're going to do that. So we always say, look, we feel things are a bit tight in that situation. We really want to update the bathrooms, the kitchen. We want to get a roofing inspector, a new mechanical system because we know that, well, it's their baby. It's their asset. They're probably going to do that. And we want to separate that from our incentive. If we're going into, a high street retail shop front type property, a lot of times they can be old money, never want to invest in the property. Tenants should do everything. And we've really got to hit them hard to get a low rent because we're going to be investing back in their building and educating them on the type of improvements that need to happen to their building to make it suitable for a dental clinic. Because the other thing we've really got to explain to them is when it's not a fish and chip shop or a sushi restaurant, they can really take a more substandard setup and structure with a lot lower health requirements than what we do, which is essentially, a really, really, really stringent health environment. So from that point of view, every building needs to be assessed on its own merits, and the negotiation lever depends on who you're dealing with. And with a lot of these new developments, which we're seeing a lot of dentists go into because of the high foot traffic locations, it's really about understanding if it's a fund owned, like a property fund, they'll throw a heap of cash at you because they need to get income in as soon as possible. So they're the reverse. They want the highest rent possible, the longest term possible, because that looks the best on their spreadsheets. And they're happy to hide cash contributions because for some reason it doesn't impact the numbers for them as much. So I'd say every landlord's got very different priorities when you step into negotiate.
So I guess from a negotiation point of view, step number one is to know your landlord and understand what's important to them. What other negotiation strategies or tactics might you want to employ as you're negotiating a lease, or even if you're negotiating a sale as well? But you've had much experience, tons of experience negotiating. What little things have you learned along the way that might be just good tactics or strategies for the listeners to adopt if they're doing it themselves?
One of the first ones I'd say, which I think is very relevant to dental space, is not to sit on the deal too long. Too often we'll get a phone call from a dentist saying, oh, look, I've been kind of negotiating for a few months. I can't quite get it to where I want it to be. Can you have a look at it? And we'll get on the phone to the agent just to sound out, if they've maximised the deal or if there's any room for improvement. Often they're really frustrated. Yeah. They'll say, we had a couple of quick offers and then they disappeared for a few weeks. naturally because they're thinking about it. It's a big decision. But instead of communicating that, they just drop off the radar, and then they fire up again. The accountant gets involved to help them, and then they drop off again. The lawyer helps them, and then they're really frustrated. And the landlord's also frustrated by this stage, and they're really saying, we don't care if it's a great tenant and a great deal, we just don't want to deal with them anymore. And that can be really hard because we've got to try and patch it together again.
Yep.
I think it's just because the time poor nature of dentists. It's a big decision. So if it's not a fluid negotiation, it can get parked to the side. So I think communication is really important. Even if it is, look, I'm just thinking about if it's the right move for me, they'll really appreciate that.
Yep.
Also to understand that there's there's levers in the negotiation. So if a really big incentive is important to you because you want to reduce the risk of setting up, you might need to wear a slightly higher rent, or you may need to look at more of a stage rent. So if you say, look, the rent needs to be significantly less in the first 2 years, I'm only going to have 1 to 2 chairs in the location, but I'm happy to pay a premium in 3 to 4 years' time. There's a lot of ways that you can massage the numbers to make it really attractive to them. I'd always hold back on your terms. A lot of dentists go in at 10 years straight off the bat. I'd always go in at 5 to 6, never go in at 10. I mean, reluctantly push to 10, even if you were comfortable there in the first place. Make it a big deal when you give them a win.
Yep.
If they say, look, we're only doing 10-year terms, you just say, look, I'm just going to go away and think about it, talk to my advisors, talk to my partner. And then when you go back and say, look, we're willing to accept the 10, make it like it's a massive decision that you've made and you're doing it because you really want to appease them. And then always have you, and this is what I need for me to give you that.
So the reciprocity, just like if I'm going to scratch your back here, this is what I need in return.
Yeah, definitely.
Mate, you've spoken about agents a bit, actually, and you spoke about the frustrations. And I don't reckon there's anyone who's been involved in property for any length of time that probably hasn't experienced frustration the other way as well. So I'm sure agents get frustrated with dentists, dentists get frustrated with agents. And, rightly or wrongly, and I've worked with some wonderful agents in the past, but rightly or wrongly, some agents get tarred with a bit of a brush of just being a bit tricky or duplicitous even. Not saying that's necessarily true, but that's the perception. How do you work with an agent successfully? Because you do this all day, every day. You must have wonderful relationships with agents across lots of locations, and you wouldn't be in business if you hadn't nurtured those relationships. How do you manage to work with agents productively over a long period of time?
But it is a delicate relationship that we have with them because naturally the more money we win back in our client's pocket, the less money they make because they're generally, percentage driven and obviously they want to look good in their client size as well. But we've also got to make sure at the end of it, they actually really enjoyed working with us, so they want to work with us again. So the key thing I'd say around agents, and this is speaking really generally, is a lot of them aren't that knowledgeable around property. And what can happen is you approach the discussion with, we need to know power supply to the building. We need to know what wattage, is the aircon system. We need to know exactly where the data points are. And the agents actually don't know in most cases. They just don't get in the granular and in the detail. And I think as a dental tenant coming in, you actually need to know all of that. Yeah. Are the walls going to be acoustically lined? What are the ceiling heights? What kind of ceiling grid are they using? You've got all these questions. And if you haven't got them, your fit-out team might have them or whoever's representing you might have them. In a lot of cases, really what you're doing is you're making a lot of work for the agent and they're just saying, look, I don't know. I just want to lease the property. A lot of them are just there to open the door, walk you around, say, what do you think? Can you sign the deal? Because I want to get paid. So you've got to make it easy for them. That's probably the biggest thing I'd say. And it's surprising how many agents, when it gets difficult, are actually really happy to connect you with the owner. So it's a great question to say look, I'm sorry I'm coming in with all the information. We apologise a lot because it just seems to soften the tone, even though what we're asking for, they really should have. Yeah. And we just simply say, look, I've got a list of 25 things I need. Would it be easier for you if I just went straight to the owner and you could CC me in? And then we generally just send an email to them saying, thanks so much for your time, Mr. Agent. You've been, wonderful helping us on site. Make them sound good on email. Yep. And then just say, here are the questions for the landlord. They've all got egos, so I guess I'm saying stroke the ego a little bit and almost remove them from the discussion. I'm surprised that landlords are happy to step in considering they're paying the agent, but they always do. Yep. And we're able to get all the information we need, and it's just a more seamless process for both parties.
That's fantastic. That's a really good strategy. I like that. So, ladies and gents, that's what we call a rider-downer right there. Hey, Julian, one of the things I've always been impressed about the way you guys work is you blend the location and property strategies with the business strategies. And coming back to what we spoke about earlier in the conversation, I wanted to ask you about the interaction between location strategy, property strategy and business strategy, and how you see those three things coming together. Because again, I think, one of the things we spoke about just a moment ago is you mentioned the number of chairs in the practice, and that's obviously going to be part of the business strategy. So I just thought it'd be useful to understand the intersection where those three things come together.
Yeah, and I think I'll almost go back to your first question today, which was, how do we get into the space and into dental? I mean, I think the first healthcare client modality we worked with was dental on the business side, because a lot of our clients just started asking us. They started saying, hey, we need help setting up our practice. And we were just really curious. I mean, as business people, we're running small business ourselves. We're very strategic in our own investment mindset. We just started asking the questions that we thought they should be asking of themselves with regards to what's the optimal patient look like, and how would they get to you, and what would they want to experience when they get there. And we just started asking all of these questions, and we started to realize that a lot of times our clients just didn't have the answers. So we went out there to source the data to basically fulfill the need as to what we thought was going to be relevant. Because I think that the hard thing is, some of the areas that are most underserviced are actually near impossible to find property in.
Yeah.
So then we realised that's why it's very competitive in the neighbouring suburb, because property is easily obtained, planning permits are easily obtained, and et cetera. It just makes sense for everyone to be there. So then we know, well, okay, in that area where there's no commercial property, it's a ground-up project strategy only. You've got to go and knock down a couple of properties and build a purpose-built clinic. Well, that's a high-risk strategy right there. Mm-hmm. That doesn't suit your profile. So we can quickly start to put a line through areas just based on, we've got the data points, but then we also see your risk profile, and those two things aren't coming together very well. And that's why a lot of our planning meetings and discussions are very specific to the client's needs. And what we simply do is just share screens, look at our data point programs. We look at, Googling, we're looking at recent property sales. We're looking at recent deals we've done in the area. And we're pulling together lots of different pieces of information to see what really makes sense to the dentist about what they want to do. I'd say most clients that are setting up second, third, fourth practices are generally really confident in the business model, but maybe need some calibration on the location piece and where they want to go. But there's generally something that's really driving it. Like, we've got some dentists that are going to come on as partners living in those areas, or we've got dentists that are coming on that have been working in those areas and don't have, restrictions of trade. So there's a lot of other information that the clients bring in, and we're just complementing it with more of the data pieces that we know, and then also the property information intel that we have with what's out there and what's possible. Because most times, if there's an opportunity or need, there's a speed to market that's required in dental as well. I think it's by far the most competitive landscape of all the other healthcare modalities that we look at, or sectors. So often, if there's an opportunity that's identified the market, most times the dentists want to move really quick.
Mate, I love that. And I love the fact that there is this interplay between the three different levels of strategy, the location, the property, and the business strategy, because at the end of the day, they all come together. And for the business to work, you've got to be in a good location. You've got to have the right property with the right amount of capacity, the right amount of chair space, and all those sorts of things. Because you get that wrong, then the business doesn't work either. And then you're back to the drawing board again, which is a very, very, very expensive exercise if you get it wrong. So, Julian, given you've lived in this space for a long period of time now, you've seen it, done it, from A to Z many times over, I wanted to just round out our conversation by thinking, like, if there was a couple of key points you thought, if only dentists would remember these 3 or 4 or 5 key points, it doesn't have to be 5, but what are the things, if you could just whisper in someone's ear, that you go, hey, before you do anything, think about A, B, and C? Yeah,
I truly believe probably the most powerful experience I could have would be around collaboration. I love, every advisor you deal with is always going to reach their limitations, and then they start to have maybe a broad knowledge on the neighbouring, discussion points. So, for example, your construction company might know a little bit about property, but not enough to make that decision. Your property team might know a little bit about the business, but not enough to give you business advisory. If you can put key experts in the room together to help you devise the right plan, workshop the plan, see where the holes are, generally you're just making more informed, lower risk decisions that are going to have a higher profit quicker. So I think for us, 30-minute discussion with the accountant, the financial advisor, the business consultant, you in the room, Jesse, guiding them on that, challenging them on that, you get to the answer quicker. So instead of taking 3 months deliberating over an idea, all of a sudden it's a 30-minute meeting. And everyone's able to seek each other's counsel. So I think that collaboration piece and actually having the right people in the right seats, same as you would in your business. Practice manager wouldn't fill in for the dentist if they're not there. You shouldn't do that, in the business planning and the strategy side of business either.
Fantastic, mate. Well, I'm going to call that the gospel according to Julian. The collaboration piece is really key, and I've seen that in action. And I've been in on some of those meetings with you recently, and I've seen just how effective that is. And so, for those listening, I'd really encourage you to talk to your advisors. Your property people, your accountants, your lawyers, all those sorts of people. As Julian has indicated, it really does save time, and we've seen that with the clients we work with. It's just been really beneficial to get everyone on the same page at the same time, and it saves an enormous amount of time. Julian, mate, you've been incredibly generous with your time today, mate. So from all of us here, thank you. I always enjoy talking to you, mate. I always learn so much. I always get a perspective that is really thought-provoking, really interesting, and it elevates my thinking. So I just want to say thank you, mate.
Same for me, Jesse. I'm always learning from you too, mate. So thanks for having me.
Pleasure. All right, mate. We'll catch up soon.
Thank you for listening to the Savvy Dentist podcast. For more episodes, go to drjessiegreen.com/savvydentist. And to discover how to build a high-performance dental practice, visit drjessiegreen.com and download the free report.